So we are going to take our finished embroidery and mount it. I have a couple that I already did that are not secured in, and I'm going to show you the difference between this sort of mounting, which you can see is a little bit padded, and this, which is completely flat. I think this is a little more modern look. Personally, I like it in a clean setting like this. But I like the way that it adds a little bit of dimension to this sort of slightly more ornate bezel. So I'm just simply adding a piece of felt. That's the only difference. Usually if I don't use felt, I will use another piece of fabric in the same color, just because sometimes if you use linen, your colors aren't quite as true depending on what you put behind it, and I think it does need just a little tiny bit of extra backing, unless it's a really dense fabric. Like this blue twill is really pretty thick, so, and I think that this black was as well. So I don't leave it. It's up to you whether you want to back it. But I will cut my felt sometimes, depending on how much extra poof I want. Sometimes I'll cut it the exact same shape as the disc. Sometimes I'll leave it slightly bigger than the disc but smaller than the embroidery. If you do that, it's going to give you even more poof. You just need to make sure that you don't make it so big that it doesn't sit in. So this is not an incredibly deep bezel. These are by Nun Design. Some of them that she sells are deeper than this, and if they're deeper than this, then yes, I will make my felt bigger. So it's kind of, what I suggest you do is play around with something that you haven't actually stitched first. Play around with plain fabric until you've got what what you're happy with, and then go ahead and mount your embroidery, because you don't want to mess up on something that you've spent time creating. So all you do is take any scrap of thread, and I don't use any more than 4 strands because I don't want to add too much bulk to the backing, and you're just going to use a running stitch, and you can start from the inside or the outside. Also, you want to try to cut your fabric so that there's not too much of that either. So let's just make sure that this is the right size. Yeah, and I think it's going to be. If there's too much overlap on the back, actually, we're going to trim this a tiny bit. If there's too much overlap, you're going to have a hard time making it sit right. So you don't want that either. So I am just going to trim this a little bit more so that I don't have too much extra stuff between my embroidery and the bezel, because you do want it to sit flat eventually without too much poof. So I think that's better. And depending on the size, I guess that's, what is that? Maybe 1/3 of an inch extra. And this is the exact same size. So, okay, so that should be good. You can check by just folding over the edges, and if they touch, that's too much. If they don't touch, that's great. You don't want to do not enough, because then you could pull your you could pull out, and that's not good either if you pull through your fabric. So you don't want to stitch too close to the edge, because that you could rip your stitches out. You don't want to stitch too close, because then you might run the risk of not being able to see it. So I'm going to go about in the middle here. And it's just a running stitch. It's just a very simple stitch. And you're doing exactly that. You're running. Now, usually I would use just 3 strands of floss. This is 4. I probably should have pulled one out. I guess it'll be extra secure. I just don't want it to be too much stuff. So we'll see how it looks. We're almost to the end. Okay, so we're back to where we started. I'm gonna pull till that knot is there, and then open it up enough that you can put your felt in. And put your metal disc in. And if for some reason you don't have a metal disc, every once in a while I'll lose one. I lost one of these here. You can use really heavy duty cardstock or mat board. You just got to be careful if you use something that's not metal that it's not going to crumble in on itself, because I'll get really aggressive with how tight I pull this, and I've bent mat board before. So okay, so you can see I really pulled it close. If I had gone any closer to my embroidery, that would not allow me enough room to tighten it, and that would be a problem. So just flip it over, make sure it's centered, and then you're going to pull to cinch this up a little bit. And then you're going to start sort of, I think of it as a corset. My floss is over here, so I'm going to go to the opposite side, and I'm going to zip up a little corset here. And just zip back and forth a little bit. Not pulling super tight until you make sure that this is centered exactly where you want. And that is, so I'm going to go ahead and tighten it up a bit. And you just work your way around. And this is where I'm talking about, if you were to not leave enough fabric, and then if you were to wind up, using and catching this much fabric, you could rip that out. So it's good to leave enough that you can reach closer in, so that it won't rip the fabric. So cinching it down like a corset. Not that I've ever worn one, but it's the best analogy I can think of. And as you go back and forth, you can see that it's flattening that fabric. And on the good side, you can also see that it is smoothing the edges. And anywhere that there's a bump, like right here there's a bump, that means there's probably a pucker of fabric. Yep, there's a pucker of fabric over there. So it looks like I did not cut myself enough floss, or my scrap wasn't long enough. But that's okay. I can knot this off and make one more pass with some different floss. So and I made sure to use a contrasting color so that you could see my stitches, and it doesn't look real pretty, but it's definitely secure, especially after I go around with this next round of stitches. It'll get even more secure. So let's just take a look again, because you can wiggle this until you've got it really tightened up. You can move that around a tiny bit. And this design is actually really easy to center it. Some designs are a little bit harder to center it, but that's going to work fine. And you can see there's going to be a tiny bit of gap in between the edge of the disc or the embroidery and the bezel, and I'm okay with that. If I wanted to get rid of that, I could, like I said, fold the fleece over and use a bigger piece of fleece. But I think that's going to look fine. I like it. I'm just not going to pull too tight on any of this. So let's just make sure that we've gotten rid of any of these bumpy areas by pulling them tighter. Okay. If you have any questions about any of this, you can always message me either through Etsy or Instagram, or I have an email. Maybe one more over here. In order to get over there, I want to come over here first. Where was it? Right there. You can also go on top. You can come from this direction. doesn't really matter. And you can see how that rounded off that edge there. So there's maybe one more right there. And I feel like sometimes that's how you can tell a pendant that's been like really nicely made and one that's been sort of sloppily put together is the way that it's mounted on the disc or whatever it is it used to insert into the pendant. So you want to make sure you get rid of all that stuff because there's no reason not to. Just keep checking. Okay, I think that looks good. Maybe this little guy right here. Oop, see, that just pulled through. All right, I think that's a sign that we're done. So I'm going to tie that off. And snip my thread. And so you can see how this is fairly flat. If I use too much fabric, this can raise up and create something of a puckered, you know, too much stuff here, and then that makes it hard to mount it. So that's flat enough. And then we're just going to lay it in here. And I like this glue. And I think I'm gonna need some pliers to open it. It glues itself shut on a regular basis, so